Zack is a gardener on the collections team at the U.S. Botanic Garden. At the garden, Zack maintains our diverse collection of carnivorous plants and helps care for our large orchid collection. At home, Zack is an avid plant enthusiast, growing over 200 plants, including orchids, aroids, and carnivorous plants. Welcome, Zack.
Hi there. Thank you, Grace, for the wonderful introduction, and welcome to this program on growing slipper orchids. So as Grace mentioned, yes, I'm on the collections team here at the garden, so I take care of a lot of things, but one of my major responsibilities is taking care of a lot of our orchid collection. And I'm fortunate enough to be taking care of our slipper orchid collection. Slipper orchids are plants that I hold very near to my heart. They're one of my favorite plants to grow, and they're extremely rewarding. And I'm hoping through this program, you'll be able to learn a little bit more about slipper orchids and their culture. So let's start in. I'm going to pull up some slides for everyone. Can everyone see that?
Looking good. Thanks, Zack.
Great. So here is a little bit of an introduction picture and some background information on the slipper orchids. So slipper orchids are in the subfamily of orchids Cypripedioideae, and we'll get a little bit more about subfamilies shortly, but all of the slipper orchids are contained in this group. This photograph you can see up on the slide is a beautiful example of two color forms of Paphiopedilum delenatii, a slipper orchid from Vietnam. But all of the slipper orchids are in this Cypripedioideae family. Interesting about the nomenclature, it's a little important to know why they're called the Cypripedioideae. This subfamily is named after the genus Cypripedium, which we'll go over in a little bit. But the nomenclature comes from the first part of the word refers to the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. And that's actually referring to Aphrodite, who rose out of the ocean onto that island. And pedium, or pedioideae, the suffix ped refers to feet or shoes. So it's referring to these flowers having a modified petal that kind of looks like a shoe. So these are flowers that look like shoes that would be pretty enough that Aphrodite herself could wear them. So a little bit more about this family. This is a very, very basic cladogram to show the diversity in the Cypripedioideae. So a little bit of background, if you're not familiar with a diagram like this, it's a taxonomic diagram. And taxonomy, in basic terms, is the way that we group organisms. So evolutionarily, organisms are grouped in different ways. And in plants, we have the orchid family, which all have very similar flowers. Within the orchid family, because there's over, I think now, according to Kew, over 28,000 species of orchids that exist, there's lots of similarities between many of those species. And depending on their flower structure, we group them into different groups. So all of the slipper orchids are contained in the group Cypripedioideae. Now, within that subfamily of orchids, there are 5 different genera, which you can hear up in the screen. And I have 2 of these genera here on display today, and I'll be able to show you photos of the other ones as well. So the Paphiopedilum are Asian slipper orchids. The Cypripedium are temperate ground-growing orchids, Phragmipedium from the Americas, Mexipedium from Mexico, and Selenopedium from Northern South America. And I actually have a little map here to show you guys kind of where these orchids are growing. So you can see the slipper orchids are widespread throughout the world, except in Australia. And this map is a little bit outdated. There was a recent discovery of Cypripedium calceolus. I believe it was in Algeria, and that was fairly recent. So they are present in Africa. So they're everywhere in the world except Australia and certain island nations, but you can see they're quite widespread. In addition, this map doesn't show the full distribution now of Selenopedium. You can see in the gray area, it's just the northern parts of South America, but according to Kew, there are certain species of Selenopedium that grow further down into the Amazon. So you can see they're very widespread, and you'll notice that there's even a whole area of green in North America, and specifically the United States and Canada. So there are lots of slipper orchids that grow here in the United States, and we'll get to showing some of those right now. So the first family we'll go over is the family or the genus of orchids we'll talk about are the Cypripedium. That is the genus that this subfamily of orchids is named after, Cypripedium. And Cypripedium are generally cold temperate orchids that grow in the northern hemisphere for the most part. You can see their distribution back in this map. But Cypripedium are quite interesting because these are orchids that you can find here in DC. So this is a Cypripedium parviflorum. This is one of our collection items here at the Botanic Garden. And you can see the beautiful pouch-shaped petals to these orchids. Another genre in the Cypripediordia are the Paphiopedilum, or the Asian slipper orchids. And these are two collection items we have here. Paphiopedilum insigne. The Latin name for that one, the specific epithet, actually comes from the word badge or medal, and it refers to the beautiful medallion-looking flowers. The Paphiopedilum ferianum is another very coveted slipper orchid. This one was searched for a while in the wild, and lots of money was offered for its rediscovery. But this is a very, very unique slipper orchid that's used a lot in breeding because of the unique shape of the flowers. Another genre in the Cypripediordiae are the Phragmipedium. This is a Phragmipedium giganteum. It's a hybrid slipper orchid. You can actually see this one on display now in our orchid house. And this is an enormous example of an orchid. As you can tell by the name, giganteum refers to the size. We have another Phragmipedium here, and you can see how large they are. So Phragmipedium are quite large orchids. There are also ones that are quite small, but they're very vigorous growers, and for the most part, they're from Central and South America. Another genre of in the subfamily Cypripediordiae are the Mexipedium, and there's only one species in the genus Mexipedium, and that's Mexipedium xerophyticum, and it actually comes from Mexico, as the generic epithet implies. And this is a photo I'm sure some of you might recognize where this is. This is a photo I took at Longwood Gardens a couple years ago of one of their Mexipedium specimens. And they're actually quite adorable little plants. They're really interesting among slipper orchids because they'll actually spread through rhizomes, which is really neat. And they're not the biggest. So this is probably in a 12-inch terracotta pot. So you can imagine this is a quite small plant. And the Mexipedium are generally growing in exposed areas on limestone cliffs. Lots of these Cypripediordiae really like limestone, and they'll grow in areas with almost neutral to alkaline pHs. And the specific epithet of this plant, xerophyticum, refers to a drier growing plant. So this plant has very thick, fleshy leaves for storing water. And the last genre, this is a photo from Kew Gardens, the Selenopedium. It's a little bit of an obscure genre. They're not very common in cultivation, and they're actually very difficult to grow. They're often growing in sandy, grassy slopes in tropical areas, and you'll see it's a quite interesting flower. Speaking of the flowers in the Cypripediordiae, we've talked a little bit about the genre and how they look, and obviously they're all slipper orchids, but it's important to know what unites all of these plants. So I'm actually going to cut off a flower from one of these orchids to try and show you a little bit closer up what the parts of the flowers are. So orchids are monocots, and we have a wonderful sign in our conservatory in our tropics describing the differences between monocots and eudicots. And generally, monocots are plants that have flowers in parts of threes, and they will also generally have leaves with parallel veins on them. So the orchids generally have flowers in parts of three, and if you're familiar with orchids at all, they have flowers that have a modified petal called a lip, and generally orchids will have 3 petals and 3 sepals. But if you're looking up close at this flower, you might think to yourself, there's some things missing here. So all Cypripediordiae have, first of all, a lip that's specially shaped called a pouch or a slipper. And this labellum is very interesting because they're all pouch shaped. And that's used for actually trapping insects to get them to pollinate the flower. And I'll cut this open in a second to try and show you. The next parts of the flower, so we have petal 1 here, which is the labellum, and then we have 2 other petals, the lateral petals, and these look very similar to normal orchid petals. This part behind, the spotted part right here, is called the dorsal sepal. All orchids have this. If you look at your Phalaenopsis at home, you can point out the dorsal sepal really easily. So we've gone over 3 petals, one of them being the lip and the dorsal sepal. But if we look at the back of the flower and we're thinking to ourselves, there's parts of 3, it looks like there's some sepals missing on here. There's only 1 sepal. So in the Cypripedioideae, the lateral sepals of the flower are actually fused into 1. So you'll see there's only 1 sepal here. And if we look at the flower from the side, you can see that the 1 sepal and the dorsal sepal will cover up the petals and protect them as they're growing. I'm going to try and slice this guy open to show you kind of some parts that are going on in the flower. So first I'm going to remove the labellum, or the lip of the flower. And this is actually a common practice in breeding Paphiopedilum to get to the reproductive parts of the flower. So the next parts of the flower, and I'm going to remove one of these petals too so you can kind of get a closer look, are the true reproductive parts of this flower. Now, flowers are used for reproduction, but we're talking about the male and female parts of this flower. So you can see this little dangly bit right here sticking out of the middle, and that's called the column. And columns are what unite all orchids. All orchids have columns where the male and female parts are fused. And yes, there are some orchids which will produce flowers that are only male or flowers that are only female at a time. But in general, most orchids have their male and female parts fused in a column. If we're looking at the front of this column, you'll see this big flat part kind of hiding everything. And that's called the staminode, or the staminode shield, it's sometimes referred to. And it's very prominent in the subfamily Cypripedioideae. You'll notice it covers up a lot of the other reproductive parts. The next part you'll see underneath the staminode is actually the female part of the flower. So when an insect falls into this lip, it is actually lured up the back of the lip. If you can see, they're often clear or lighter in color, and it will lure the insects to crawl up through there, and they will pass by the female part of the flower. And that is to try and get the insects to pollinate the female part of the flower before they are collecting pollen and leaving. The next part they will actually pass by. These are really small, but you can see this little brown dot right above the female part, and that's one of the pollinia. And the insect, usually it's a larger insect like a bee or something, will crawl up by and it will collect the pollinia, and it will exit through the top of the flower, and hopefully it'll fall into another slipper orchid, and that process will be repeated. So it'll deposit the pollen before collecting more to ensure that the flowers are cross-pollinated. And those are some of the similar characteristics that all of these plants have. So that was a little bit just of background about the plants. Hopefully that gives you a better context of where they're growing and how they're growing in nature. So you will be able to know a little bit more about what these plants have in their natural habitats before trying to grow them in the house. These are all plants. All of these plants here in front of me are plants that you can grow at home, and they're wonderful to grow at home. And hopefully through our question and answer next, that we will be able to reveal some of the secrets that it takes to grow some of these orchids.
Thanks, Zach. I'm going to kick off our first question here. Folks are wondering, can they grow slipper orchids in a terrarium?
Yes, slipper orchids are great candidates for terrariums. The number one thing you want to know when you're putting slipper orchids in terrariums is they really like airflow. So if water is sitting on the leaves for too long, it's generally going to cause the crown of the plant to rot. You don't want water to be down in the crown of the plant because over time that's going to cause fungal and bacterial infections to happen. Slipper orchids while they are very hardy, are very susceptible to fungal and bacterial infections. So if you're growing them in a terrarium, you want to make sure that it's open for parts of the day and the plants dry out before sunset, or that you have a little circulating computer fan somewhere on the terrarium to make sure that there's not too much humidity and water built up on the plants. Now, while they're great for terrariums, they also grow wonderfully out of terrariums. It's almost a little bit easier to grow them on a windowsill. If you're looking for a cute little display or something, Paphiopedilum make great additions to smaller terrariums, but they'll probably be a little bit happier if you can get their leaves dry and make sure that they're not having water built up on them.
That's awesome, Zach. We've got someone wondering here, if folks are looking for places that might have slipper orchids that they could add to their collections, what's a resource they could check out to look for places that might have some awesome orchids?
Yeah, so slipper orchids are widely available now. There's plenty of online nurseries, and there's many nurseries in the mid-Atlantic that sell orchids, and specifically slipper orchids, and there's some that even focus on them. I'd highly recommend you check out the American Orchid Society. They have a wonderful list of vendors, and they often send out lists of vendors in their monthly orchids newsletters. You can also look for other local orchid societies in your area. They're often wonderful resources for finding places that might not be as well advertised. So I would definitely try and check out some of your local orchid societies in addition to the American Orchid Societies for better finding stores and online vendors that ship and sell near you.
Thanks, Zach. We've got another question here about fertilizing. Someone recently heard that you're not supposed to fertilize orchids after they've started blooming. Any recommendations for fertilizing an orchid sort of after the buds appear or when it's in bloom? What are your recommendations?
So I've heard that from a couple of my friends as well, but I grow thousands of orchids. I'm taking care of a lot of orchids, and it's a lot to specifically fertilize each individual plant. Now, orchids are living organisms and they want to live. So I generally am fertilizing at a constant feed, whether the plants are in flower or not. And I'm fertilizing at a very low rate all of the time. In the winter, I'll generally slow that rate down. In the summer and the warmer season, I'm giving the plants a little bit more fertilizer, but all of the plants are getting the same amount of fertilizer, whether they're in bloom or not. And I'll show you this Paphiopedilum retricianum right here, which has a wonderful display of many, many flowers on it. And this plant has actually been in bloom since around January. So it's been in bloom for a while, and it also gets constant fertilizer. So in my experience, it doesn't cause the flowers to fade faster. If you are having an experience where you're fertilizing plants and the flowers are fading faster, it might be you're using a different formulation or you're fertilizing at a different rate than I am. But it's something you kind of have to gauge for yourself. If you're fertilizing the plants and the flowers are falling off much faster, maybe you want to change that, or maybe there's something in your culture that's causing the plants to have the flowers fade faster. But in my experience, generally fertilizing does not cause blooms to fade faster.
Thanks, Zach. Someone has some paths that he says are turning black or brown. The flowers are turning black or brown. Any ideas what might be the cause behind that? Yeah,
so these are reproductive structures on the plant. Flowers are for the purpose of reproduction. A plant doesn't need to make flowers. So it's going to send up flowers when they're really, really happy and they want to make more of themselves. Or if they're kind of stressed and they're on the verge of dying, and they say, okay, I want to set seed before I die. But slipper orchids are sending up flowers generally once a year. Most of these genera of slipper orchids are only blooming once a year, except for the exception of Phragmipedium, which are a little bit faster growing. And you can sometimes get them to bloom twice a year if your culture is really good. But the flowers on slipper orchids are generally lasting anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 or 5 months, depending on if it's a species or a really mass-produced hybrid that's really trying to breed them for flower longevity. So if the flowers are turning brown on your orchid, the first thing I would say is they're probably just old. It takes a lot of energy for these plants to flower. As I mentioned, they don't need to flower, but they're flowering when they want to reproduce. So they're not going to hold those flowers on them forever. If they have them out for a few weeks to a few months, they're going to say, okay, nothing's pollinated this. I'm going to throw in the towel for this year and I'll make another flower next year. So I wouldn't be too concerned. But if the flower opened and it faded very, very quickly, I would say there's probably something wrong with the culture of your plant. Most likely it has to do with watering. Generally, the plants aren't going to flower if they aren't. They're only going to flower really if they're getting the light that they want to get. These orchids are growing in bright diffused light, but if they're sending out a flower and it fades really quickly, it's probably something to do with your watering. The plant probably doesn't have a really good root system, so it's not able to support that flower for a long amount of time. So I would definitely check up on your watering. It would probably be an over and under watering issue. Both issues kind of cause the same problem. They kill the roots, so you want to make sure that the roots are okay to be able to support these flowers. And if you checked your watering and you've checked and it's a flower that faded very quickly, sometimes it's just a cultivar or a plant that has flowers that rotate very quickly. We have plants in the collection where flowers will only bloom for a couple weeks. Like I found that Paphiopedilum in the subgenre Parvicepalum, like the Delenatia I showed you in the first page, ones with kind of poofy, fluffy looking flowers with lighter colors. They generally aren't as waxy, and the flowers will fade much quicker than something like this Gratricianum in the Paphiopedilum subgenre. These have very waxy flowers and they last a really long time. That was a long way to say there's a lot of things that could be happening with it, but I hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Zach. And what should someone do if the leaves are turning black or brown on their orchid?
That would be more concerning. Leaves are not permanent structures on these plants. It's important to know the growth habit of Paphiopedilum before talking about the way that their leaves die. And it's important to know about the growth of orchids, even before talking about that. So I'm going to take a couple back steps and hopefully be able to answer your question completely and fully. There's two ways that orchids can grow, monopodial or sympodial. Monopodial orchids will grow along one apical meristem, and they'll keep growing taller and taller and taller, and they'll keep growing like that forever. And every organ of that orchid is going to arise from that one axis. So you'll have roots, leaves, and flower spikes continuously. There's also orchid, well, an example of a monopodial orchid you've probably seen very often are Phalaenopsis or Vandas. But Paphiopedilum and Cypripedium, Phragmipedium, all the Cypripedioideae, they are not monopodial, even though they look very similar to a Phalaenopsis. These orchids are actually growing along a rhizome, and each time they're producing a new growth, or a fan as we call them in slipper orchids, they're going to bloom off the top, and that fan is done forever. So sympodial orchids, as these are called, will continue producing new growths, and their apical meristem will produce a flower, and then they'll make new growths on the side of that. So these types of orchids, once they flower off the top of their growth, that growth will never continue growing. And over the next few years, it will use all its energy up and slowly start to die. So if you've had a growth where it's flowered and then those leaves start to yellow over time, that's completely normal. And it's actually very common to have yellow leaves on your slipper orchids because they are in this constant cycle of renewing themselves. If the leaves are at the base of the fans, they should start dying from the bottom up. So the oldest leaves to the newest leaves. If you're having leaves dying that are closer to the center of your growths, or the plant hasn't flowered off of them yet, or even if it has barely started growing and the leaves just shrivel up and die, usually it has to do with a root problem as well. These orchids have very sensitive roots, and if they don't have enough roots to support the plant, they can start to die and fade very quickly. These orchids, as I mentioned as well, are susceptible to fungal and bacterial infections. So if you're noticing splotching on the leaves, or mushy areas, or striping kind of on the leaves and circular patterns, and they're dying irregularly, then I would probably attribute that to disease and probably improper culture. So you want to make sure that these plants don't have water sitting on them for long periods of time. I do water mine in the shower, but I put a fan next to them so they completely dry out afterwards. So if you're getting water on the leaves, that could be causing them to die as well.
Thanks, Zach. And speaking of water, someone is wondering, is there anything they have to think of in terms of water chemistry when they're watering their orchids?
Yeah, so generally orchids are liking water that's free of a lot of contaminants, but ironically, these orchids are from areas with calcareous rock. So when I'm talking about slipper orchids in the home, generally we're talking about Paphiopedilum and Phragmipedium. Cypripedium are also wonderful to grow, but generally you're growing them outside and they're getting rainwater. But the orchids you're growing inside, these Paphiopedilum and Phragmipedium, generally are growing on areas with limestone or calcareous rock. And that rock especially with acid rain, releases a lot of minerals into the water. So these orchids are used to water that have lots of dissolved solids. And where I live, my apartment has very, very hard water, and it has hard water stains all over everything, all in the windows, all in the shower, all in my reptile cages. But my slipper orchids absolutely love it because it has that high concentration of calcium in the water. In some of my other orchids don't like it so much, but the slipper orchids really like it. If you have really soft water and water with very low dissolved salts and water with very low mineral concentration, like we have in our greenhouses, we're using RO water to water our orchids. I'll generally add something like lime or oyster shells to the mix to kind of bring that pH up. As I mentioned, these are orchids that really like neutral to alkaline pHs. So you want to make sure that your potting media is reflecting that. And if your water isn't already rich in calcium, then you want to make sure you're adding something to your mix to be able to support plants like this.
That is a perfect segue into our next question, which is what type of soil is best for slipper orchids, or what medium do you recommend?
Yeah, so with all of these slipper orchids, they all kind of want, there's a lot of similarities with them, but there's also a lot of differences. So generally speaking, a lot of people think of slipper orchids being terrestrials, but these are generally orchids like the Paphiopedilum and the Phragmipedium, in addition to the Mexipedium, are orchids that are growing in organic matter that accumulates on top of rocks. So they're not truly growing in soil, they're kind of growing above the soil in the layer of leaves and decomposing litter in forests. So knowing that, these orchids love having lots of water. They don't have pseudobulbs to store water like many other orchids do, but they also like a lot of air to their roots. They're not growing in hard clay like you would find here outside. So you want to make sure you're using a mix that's both water retentive and well draining. And that can be a lot of things. I have grown slipper orchids at home when I don't want to water them as often in 100% sphagnum moss. And some people would call me crazy, but it works. And if you're watering them properly, it's something that you can do. You can also grow these orchids, and generally in the greenhouse, I prefer an airier mix and to water more frequently rather than in the home where I water less frequently and use a denser mix. In the greenhouse, I'm using a very airy mix of bark and perlite, and it's a medium-sized orchid bark and a medium-sized perlite. And really that's all I have in my mix, in addition to some oyster shell, and sometimes on smaller plants, I'll put some sphagnum moss on the top of them so they don't dry out. I've heard of growers growing Paphiopedilum in straight like peat-based growing mix. I personally haven't tried this, but I'm sure if you didn't pack it into the pot and watered very sparingly, it might work. I've also seen growers growing Phragmipedium in straight lava rock, and they just water them every day, sometimes twice a day. As long as they're getting both the water and the air to their roots, that's the important thing. And it really depends on your cultural conditions. And it's something you kind of have to hone in over time. But these are all examples of wonderful mixes that do work for these orchids. And the most important thing, if it's working for you, don't change it. Lots of orchid growers are very, they like to tell people what they're doing is not the way to do it, but there's hundreds of different ways to grow orchids. And if it's working for you, that's the most important thing. And if your results are showing that it's working for you, that's all that matters.
Thanks, Zach. Related to that, someone is wondering about rock wool cubes and whether you can use those in orchid media.
Yeah, there's actually lots of growers that use rock wool while growing Phragmipedium. Phragmipedium are generally wanting much more water than the Paphiopedilum are wanting. So Phragmipedium like to stay constantly moist. I generally am growing them at home in a mix of sphagnum moss, perlite, and bark. But rock wool is a wonderful alternative to sphagnum moss because it doesn't break down as quickly. It never breaks down. It's practically spun glass. So it's something that's going to last a long time in your media. So if you're not keen on repotting, it's going to last a lot longer than moss. You just have to remember with rock wool, it is not a renewable resource. It's something that does stay in our environment for quite a long time. So I generally prefer using moss because it is something that breaks down. But if you have an abundance of rock wool, say you had a hydroponic setup or we're growing something and you have some left over, it makes a wonderful addition to Phragmipedium. And I've seen growers online have exceptional results using rock wool as a growing medium for Phragmipedium in the home.
Someone is growing orchids in their basement and they're using overhead lights and they're wondering what the on-off cycle should be.
Yeah, so generally these orchids are from tropical areas. If you're growing Paphiopedilum and Phragmipedium, they are orchids that you could grow them all year long with 12 hours of light and they would probably do fine. But in the winter, I have my orchids under lights as well. They're next to a window, so they get a little light from the window and a little supplementary light. But it is nice to give these orchids a little bit of seasonality. It kind of helps with the blooming. Some of these orchids take, well, a lot of the Paphiopedilum will take cues from the temperature and the light cycles and will be reluctant to bloom if you're not giving them a little bit shorter days. So I would say if you're using weaker lights in a basement, probably 16 hours on in the summer, maybe 12 hours on in the winter would be fine. It really depends on what types of light and how bright they are though. So you need to know, if you're using older T5 bulbs or T8 bulbs, they're gonna be much less powerful than the newer modern LEDs that many people are using. So you wanna leave them on a little bit longer. But you can always follow manufacturer's instructions on the lights as well. There's a great series of articles that the American Orchid Society released last year on the supplemental lighting and growing orchids indoors. And I would recommend you to checking out their page as well. It's a wonderful series. I think it's a 3-part article series that has great information on how long and what types of light orchids are using. But if you want the too long didn't read answer, I would leave them on for 16 hours in the summer and 12 hours in the winter, and you'll probably be fine.
Thanks, Zach. Our next question here is related to temperature. So someone has a PAF that's doing well, but it didn't bloom this spring. And this person is just wondering, is it taking a break? Does it need lower temperatures at night? What's going to help this PAF bloom?
So as I mentioned, Paphiopedilum are sympodial orchids and are blooming at the top of each growth. And Paphiopedilum, the number one thing you have to have when growing Paphiopedilum is patience. They are much slower growing than many orchids, and sometimes it takes almost 2 years to mature growth. Even if the conditions are right, there are certain species that are just very, very slow growing, especially when they're young plants. So if your plant is not something that looks like this and has, 10 or more growths on it, they're probably taking around a year to mature each of them, sometimes longer. So generally, when you first get a Paphiopedilum, it's going to bloom every 2 years. It's going to bloom, and then it's going to take 2 years to make a new fan, and then it'll bloom again. As they start getting larger, you're generally going to get plants that are blooming every year because they have more energy and they're more vigorous. But if it didn't bloom this year and it bloomed last year, and the fan that is growing is still growing and producing leaves, it's probably going to bloom for you next year. If the fan is completely grown and it started growing a new fan next to it, you're probably doing everything right, except it might not have enough light. Light is generally the most important factor when it comes to orchid blooming. You could be doing everything else right, and if you're not giving them the right amount of light, they're probably not going to bloom for you. So you might want to move it to a brighter area. These are orchids that generally like bright indirect light, almost kind of shady conditions. In the home, I say bright indirect light. In the greenhouse, shaded, but an east or a north facing windowsill that gets a little bit of light is usually generally really great for these guys. So I would target those things first. But if your fan is still growing, it's probably going to bloom for you next year.
Thanks, Zach. And we've got some folks wondering about cross-pollinating orchids. Is that possible for a home grower? And what does that look like at home?
Oh, yeah, that's totally possible. And with modern technology, it's even possible to create your own orchid hybrids and sow the seed and grow them out. And this is not a process that's going to happen overnight. It's not like hybridizing sunflowers or zinnias where you're going to be able to make these hybrids in the same season. This is a almost decade-long process. The first thing you need to know, we already talked about the structure of these flowers, and it's cool that we have one of these out so I can show you the pollinia. You'll first have to remove the lip of the flower. So if you want to look at the flower, probably don't pollinate it because you need to kind of take them apart to get to this pollination. So the pollinia here, this brown dot, you need to remove that with a toothpick, and you can place it, you can just smear it on the female parts of the flower right here. It's almost putty-like, and you can just smear it right on there. And that's all you have to do to pollinate the flower. You can cross any Paphiopedilum with any Paphiopedilum, any Phragmipedium with any Phragmipedium. Unfortunately, in this subfamily of orchids, you cannot create intergeneric hybrids. You can't cross a Paphiopedilum with a Phragmipedium or a Paphiopedilum with a Mexipedium. They're just not compatible. But you can create seed within the same genres. So you can make Paphiopedilum hybrids. You can make Phragmipedium hybrids. Once you pollinate the flower, this is when the waiting starts. It generally takes around a year, sometimes longer, for the seeds to be produced. These are very, very, very slow growing plants, and they're even slower to set seed. So you're gonna have to wait about a year for them to set their seed. And once the seed is set, unless you have a laboratory type setup in your house, which you probably don't, you can't sow the seed in your house. Orchids depend on mycorrhizal relationships to germinate. Their seeds are extremely tiny. You'll see once these seed pods burst open, it looks like dust, and it'll fly through the wind. And in the rainforest or forest or wherever these are growing, it'll land on moist areas and have relationships with that fungus to be able to germinate. But we can't do that in the home. We can't grow fungus, the specific species of fungus we need to grow these orchids in our house. But you can send the seed pods you produce out to, there's lots of companies online, if you look up like orchid seed sowing services, you can send them out and they'll actually flask the seeds for you. This is another waiting process. Once the seeds are sent out to be flasked, it will take a very, very long time for them to germinate and grow out through those flasks. Generally, it's a couple of years that these orchids are going to be grown in vitro, which means under glass. So they're being grown in glass jars or test tubes or vials, and they're getting all their nutrients for the first few years from an artificial growing medium. And after that, after those few years, you can take those seedlings. They're still seedlings. They're still going to be tiny after a few years. They can be unflasked or deflasked. It's a very tedious project because they kind of, they're completely free of germs and mold and all kinds of diseases in these flasks. And once you take them out, they're exposed to the natural world, which has lots of diseases in it. And it takes a little bit of a clean, orderly area to be able to do that. But you can still do it in the home. You can order orchid flasks online if you want to skip all these processes and just skip straight to the flasking. And then after a few more years of growing those plants traditionally in pots, you'll be able to see the first flower. So it is a very long process. It's not something I would just jump in on an impulse and do, but it is something, if you have the time and you have the patience, it's a rewarding process. And it is something that nowadays you can luckily do in your home, especially with these services that will flask orchid seeds for you. What's interesting that you brought that up about creating hybrids with these orchids. Many orchids that you see commercially available are tissue cultured nowadays, but the slipper orchids are generally, well, they resist tissue culture. You're not able to tissue culture Paphiopedilum and I believe Phragmipedium and all the slipper orchids as well. They need to be grown from seed every single time. So even if you're getting a registered cross, it's going to be a different individual every single time, because all of these orchids that you're seeing on the market were grown from seed. We can't tissue culture them, which makes them kind of special because they're all unique and genetic individuals. If you are getting a named registered cross, one that's awarded, it's likely a division that you're getting from a grower, and you're very, very lucky if someone's giving up their divisions, because generally once they're awarded, they're very coveted by the orchid growers who have them.
Thanks, Zach. And we have a couple questions here about some of the native orchids folks can find outside. If folks have lady slipper orchids or native orchids growing in their yard or on their property, is there anything special that they should do to help care for those orchids? Yes,
Don't move them. That's the first thing I would say. Admire them from afar, or even up close, but do not try and dig up these orchids and move them. As I mentioned before, these orchids have very, very strong relationships with the mycorrhizal fungi that are found in the forests around here. And the native ones especially, they're ones that sometimes will go dormant for years at a time and depend completely on the fungus for all of their resources. So number one, don't try to move them. You might even try and dig it up and find out that the plant itself is very, very down deep and you can't even find it in the leaf litter. So don't move it. Number two, don't go and share with the entire world where they are. These are plants that are very poachable. People really like to dig these up and take them. They're very coveted by people. And if you're sharing it's sad to say that we're not supposed to be sharing lots of information about where they're found now, but unfortunately, lots of areas that do share with minimal security where they are, they do end up getting stolen, and usually they're not surviving once they're dug up. So make sure you're protecting them and keeping them safe for your local friends and family, and sharing that area with trusted people. And lastly, just enjoying them. You know, they're wonderful plants to have around. And if you have some on your property, you're very, very lucky, because they're not very common to find around anymore. I would assume you probably have Cypripedium acaulis, which is the pink lady slipper. That's probably the most common one here on the East Coast. If you're from the area, it's the pink lady slipper. They have the brown petals and sepal and a pink pouch, and they're more common than most of the Cypripedium, but they're also not something that you would just go outside and expect to see all the time. So make sure you're protecting them and looking over them, and make sure, you know, they're the type of thing that you're not sharing and going out of your way to tell people they're there. Unfortunately, nowadays, it's unfortunate that we can't do that and share it with everyone, but it's very lucky that you have them in your property.
Thanks, Zach. Someone is wondering, they live a bit north of us in Zone 5, and they're hoping to move their orchids from the basement outside for spring and summer, and then move them back inside in the fall. Is there any considerations they should take, kind of moving these orchids in and out of their home?
Yeah, so we'll start with moving them outside. Generally here in the mid-Atlantic, I don't recommend growing the tropical slipper orchids outside, because it gets really hot, and it also, our humidity and temperature fluctuates too much in the summer to do that. But if you're a little further north and it's a little bit more mild in the summer, you can probably get away with growing some of these out under a shade structure or under a tree somewhere. When you're moving them outside, you want to make sure you're not putting them into full sun. These are plants that never really want full sun ever. They are going to get burnt very quickly, and you want to make sure that you're putting them in a protected area where you know it's not going to heat up or cool down too fast. So make sure you're past your frost date. Probably you want to make sure that temperatures aren't dropping below the 50s as well. And you want to make sure they're in a protected area, and that you're focusing a lot on getting them watered. I'd expect if you're growing them outside in an area here in the United States, some of them might need water every single day. You know, here in the mid-Atlantic, some of these plants that are small, I'm watering in our greenhouses every single day. So if it's a dry day and you have plants in 3 or 4 inch pots, they might need water every single day. Moving on to the fall side of things, when you're bringing them inside, you want to keep a really close eye on the weather and make sure you're checking your local farmer's almanac for first frost dates. You want to make sure that the temperature isn't really dipping below the 50s, with the exception of a couple species of tropical slipper orchids, like Paphiopedilum, Micranthum, and Paphiopedilum armeniacum. Plants like that do like to get a little bit cold and into the upper 40s in order to flower. But generally, these are plants that don't want to dip below 50 degrees. And if they do, you might be causing cold damage to your plants. So keep a close eye on the weather. The next thing, when you're moving plants outside, you're opening up a door for insects and disease to get on the plants. So when they're in your house, generally you're not allowing as many pathogens and pests to get on the plants. And when you're putting them outside, you're opening up the world to mostly scale and mealybug is what's getting on these plants. And sometimes thrips affect the flowers, but generally we're more concerned with the foliage of the plants for their long-term health. So you want to make sure you're really scouting well and looking over all of your plants to make sure you're not bringing in mealybugs and scale into your house, because that's just going to cause nightmares, and you really don't want to have to deal with that, especially if you have a large collection of plants, because it can be very difficult to eradicate in the home. And once it's inside and you're in the winter, generally, I don't like to spray my plants. I have pets at home. I have friends that come over. I don't like to put chemicals onto my plants once they're in the house. And I recommend that you don't use harsh chemicals in your home either, because it can, once the bugs are inside for the winter, they will proliferate quite a lot in the ideal conditions they have. So make sure you're checking them really well for pests and disease when you're bringing them inside.
Thanks so much, Zach. And for our last question today, someone is just in love with the red-orange orchid that you have behind you. Can you tell us a little bit more about this particular variety?
Yes, this is Phragmipedium St. Peter. I can't tell you much about the parentage. I believe it's a more complex hybrid. I'm not 100% sure on the parentage, but it does look like it has a lot of Phragmipedium bessiae in it, which is the one of the most famous Phragmipedium. It's a red Phragmipedium, famous for having clear windows on the back of the slipper. And this hybrid does have those clear kind of little windows present on the back of the flowers. So I would expect there to be quite a bit of Phragmipedium St. Peter. And from the shape of the flowers, it looks like they're crossing with another subgenre of Phragmipedium. So the micropetalum, I believe, are the ones that Phragmipedium bessiae are in there. So you can see that there's quite a lot of different things going on in this flower. And this is a wonderful example of a beautiful large Phragmipedium. And this is totally something that you could grow on a bright windowsill at home. I grow mostly Paphiopedilum at home, but I do make space for, I have around 4 frags at my house, and they're just much more vigorous than Paphiopedilum. They generally are producing 2, sometimes even 3 new growths a year versus the Paphiopedilum, which can take, as I mentioned, 2 years if you're not growing them to their full potential. So it is a plant you could, if knowing the Greg's name, St. Peter, if you're interested, you can either check out the American Orchid Society or Orchid Web will probably have some great information about the parentage of this hybrid as well.
Thank you so much, Zach, for sharing your expertise today.